I never believed those conspiracy theories about the Cold War. You know the ones. Secret government experiments, underground bunkers in every town, families preparing for nuclear apocalypse. That stuff belonged in movies, not in the middle of Nebraska farmland where my family had lived for 3 generations. But I guess life has a funny way of proving you wrong when you've least expect it. My name's Trevor Ashford, and this story starts 6 months ago when my grandmother passed away at the age of 92. Grandma Linda was the last person alive who remembered when my grandfather, Joe Ashford, bought the 300-acre farm outside of a town called Prairie Hollow back in 1959. She'd lived in that old farmhouse every day since then, even after Grandpa Joe died in 1987 when I was just 5 years old. I inherited the property. My dad didn't want it. He'd moved to Denver decades ago and built a life as an accountant, about as far from farming as you could get. My sister was living in Boston with her wife and 2 kids, completely uninterested in returning to the Nebraska plains. That left me, the middle child who'd somehow ended up teaching high school history just 2 towns over. The farmhouse was a wreck. Grandma Linda had done her best to maintain it, but 90-year-old women aren't exactly climbing ladders to fix roof shingles. The place needed serious work, new electrical, updated plumbing, probably complete drywall replacement in half the rooms. My wife Sarah thought I was crazy for wanting to renovate instead of sell, but there was something about that house. Memories, maybe, or just stubbornness. We started the renovation in early March. I'd hired a local contractor named Dale who'd been working construction in the area for 30 years. Dale was one of those guys who could look at a wall and tell you exactly what was wrong with it, down to which joist was rotted and which wire was about to start a fire. "Your grandfather built a hell of a house," Dale told me during the first week. "Foundations solid as they come. Weird, though." "Weird how?" I asked. "Well, most farmhouses from this era, they got crawl spaces, maybe a small basement for a furnace and some storage. This place?" He knocked on the floor with his boot. "This foundation goes deep, real deep, and it's reinforced concrete. That's military-grade construction, not farm construction." I didn't think much of it at the time. Grandpa Joe had been an engineer before he bought the farm. Maybe he just wanted to build something that would last. The discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-April. We were tearing out the flooring in what used to be Grandpa Joe's study, a room my grandmother had kept locked for years after his death, only opening it occasionally to dust. Beneath the hardwood, we found the original subflooring, and beneath that, concrete. "Trevor, come look at this," Dale called out. I walked into the study to find him on his hands and knees examining a section of concrete where he'd pulled up the boards. There was a seam, perfectly straight, deliberate, forming a square about 4 feet on each side. "That's a hatch," Dale said, running his fingers along the edge. "Sealed real good, but that's definitely a hatch." My heart started pounding. A hatch to what? Only one way to find out. It took us 3 hours to break the seal. Whatever Grandpa Joe had used to close it had hardened over the decades into something almost like stone. We finally got it open with a combination of a concrete saw and good old-fashioned crowbars. The smell hit us first. Stale air, decades old, with a metallic tang that made my nose wrinkle. Below the hatch was a ladder, steel rungs bolted into concrete, descending into darkness. "You're not seriously going down there," Sarah said from the doorway. She'd driven over during her lunch break from the library where she worked. "Hell yes, I'm going down there," I said, already pulling out my phone to use as a flashlight. The ladder went down 15 feet, maybe 20. My phone light couldn't reach the bottom. Dale handed me a proper flashlight and I clipped it to my belt before starting the descent. The air got cooler as I climbed down. When my feet hit solid ground, I was standing in a corridor, concrete walls, concrete ceiling, about 6 feet wide. The flashlight beam revealed a space that extended in one direction, with what looked like doors along the sides. "What do you see?" Dale called down. "A hallway, a whole underground hallway." I started walking, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The first door I reached was steel, heavy, with a wheel lock like you'd see on a bank vault. It took all my strength to turn it, the mechanism grinding and protesting, but it finally gave way. Behind the door was a room about 20 feet square. Along one wall were shelves stocked with canned goods, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. I picked one up. Campbell's soup, the label faded but still readable. The expiration date was listed as 1963. Oh my God, I whispered. The next room was a dormitory of sorts, 4 bunk beds with thin mattresses, all made up with military-style precision. Footlockers sat at the end of each bed. A small desk on the corner held a radio, old-fashioned, the kind with vacuum tubes and dials. The third room was what really got me. It was an office, and it was filled with papers. I spent the rest of that day going through the bunker, hardly believing what I was seeing. There were more rooms, a bathroom with a chemical toilet, a storage area filled with medical supplies, a small armory, empty, thank God, and what appeared to be a communication center with equipment I didn't recognize. But it was that office that held the answers. The papers were organized in filing cabinets, meticulously labeled. Most were documents stamped with classified and top secret headers, though the ink had faded considerably. I started reading, and the more I read, the less I understood about the man I called Grandpa Joe. According to the documents, Joseph Ashford hadn't just been an engineer. He'd been a civil defense coordinator for a classified government program called Project Safeguard. The program, initiated in 1957, involved establishing a network of secret bunkers across rural America, ostensibly to house key personnel in the event of nuclear war. But it was more than that, much more. One document dated September 1962 outlined something called Protocol Songbird. The language was technical, full of jargon I had to Google on my phone, but the basic idea was clear. In the event of a nuclear attack, certain families like mine, would be evacuated to bunkers and would help coordinate the rebuilding of American civilization. My grandfather had been one of the coordinators. This bunker wasn't just a shelter, it was supposed to be a command center. I found a personal journal in the bottom drawer of the desk. The entries were in Grandpa Joe's handwriting, which I recognized from birthday cards he'd sent me as a kid. The early entries were businesslike, describing the construction of the bunker, the installation of equipment, drills he'd run with other coordinators. But the later entries got strange. November 8th, 1962. The crisis has passed, but the program continues. They want us ready for the next time and the next and the next. How long can we live like this? Linda doesn't know the full extent of it. I've told her it's just a shelter, just in case, but it's so much more. Sometimes I wonder if we're preparing to save civilization or just to survive the end of it. January 17th, 1963. Communication with Regional Command has become sporadic. I suspect budget cuts, though no one will confirm. The equipment is top-notch, but what good is it if there's no one on the other end? March 3rd, 1963. I've made a decision. The program is winding down. I can feel it. The government is moving on to other priorities, but I won't dismantle what I've built here. If there's ever a need, it will be ready. The journal entries stopped in 1964. There was no explanation, just blank pages after that. I sat in that underground office for hours, reading document after document, trying to piece together my grandfather's secret life. He'd been part of a massive thing the government had clearly kept quiet about, and he'd kept it quiet too, even from his own family. Sarah came down the ladder eventually, followed by Dale. They found me sitting at the desk, surrounded by papers. "Trevor, this is insane," Sarah said, looking around the room. "This is actually real, a real Cold War bunker." "It's more than that," I said, handing her the journal. "Read this." While she read, Dale explored the other rooms. He came back shaking his head. "I've seen bomb shelters before, but nothing like this. This is professional, government grade. Your grandfather was connected to something big." Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with the bunker. I spent every free moment down there, cataloging the contents, reading through every document I could find. I contacted a friend from college who'd become a history professor specializing in Cold War America. When I sent him photos of some of the documents, he nearly lost his mind. "Trevor, this is unprecedented," he told me over the phone. "We knew about civil defense programs, but a coordinated network of bunkers, classified protocols for civilian coordinators, this could rewrite what we know about Cold War domestic policy." "Should I contact someone? The government, maybe?" I asked. There was a long pause. Technically, those documents are still classified, even if the classification is decades old. You could be opening a can of worms, but historically, this is invaluable. Give me some time to reach out to some colleagues discreetly. While I waited, I kept exploring. The bunker was like a time capsule, preserving a moment of American history that had been largely forgotten. I found training manuals for radiation detection, maps of fallout patterns, lists of other coordinators in neighboring counties. I Googled their names, most were dead, a few were in nursing homes. But the biggest discovery came from a locked safe in the corner of the office. I'd noticed it early but hadn't been able to open it. Dale brought in a locksmith, an old guy named Frank, who took one look at the safe and whistled. Mosler, late 50s model, built like a tank. This'll take some time. It took 3 days, but Frank finally got it open. Inside were more documents, but these were different. Personal documents, letters, photos, and a smaller journal, this one leather-bound. The photos showed my grandfather in military uniform, army by the look of it, though the insignia wasn't standard. He was younger, maybe in his 30s, standing with other men in similar uniforms. The backdrop looked like a government facility, somewhere out west based on the desert landscape visible in the background. The letters were to my grandmother, but they'd never been sent. Each one started with, "My dearest Linda," and described things my grandfather couldn't tell her directly. The weight of his responsibilities, the fear that nuclear war would actually come, the guilt of keeping secrets from the woman he loved. One letter, dated October 1962, right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, was particularly haunting. "My dearest Linda, I'm writing this knowing you'll never read it, and perhaps that's for the best. The world came within hours of ending this week. You don't know that because the newspapers won't tell you how close we actually were. But I was on the radio constantly, receiving updates, preparing to execute protocols that would have changed our lives forever. If the missiles had flown, I would have brought you and the children down here. We would have survived, probably, but what kind of world would we have emerged into? What kind of life could we have built in the ashes? I joined this program because I believed in service, in duty, in protecting my country and my family. But now I wonder if we're just fooling ourselves. Can civilization really survive nuclear war, or are we just building expensive tombs? I love you. I wish I could tell you everything, but I can't, and that might be the heaviest burden of all. Joe." I had to stop reading for a while after that one. I'd never really known my grandfather. 5-year-olds don't form deep memories. But through these letters, I was getting to know him in a way I never expected. He wasn't just the friendly old farmer my grandmother had described. He was a man carrying enormous weight, living with secrets that would have crushed most people. The leather journal was the final piece of the puzzle. It was newer than the other journal, started in 1965 and running all the way to 1985, just 2 years before he died. The entries tracked the slow dismantling of Project Safeguard. Coordinators were quietly discharged, equipment was repurposed, bunkers were sealed or forgotten. My grandfather's bunker, however, remained operational, at least in theory. April 12, 1967. Received final communication from Regional Command. The program is officially concluded. All coordinators are instructed to maintain operational security and decommission facilities as they see fit. I will not decommission. This bunker represents too much work, too much history to simply fill in with concrete. Instead, I'll preserve it. Perhaps someday someone will want to know what we were prepared to do. The later entries were more reflective, philosophical even. My grandfather wrote about the changing world, about détente with the Soviet Union, about the gradual easing of nuclear tensions. He wrote about his children, my father and his siblings, and his hopes for them. He wrote about aging, about mortality, about the strange feeling of keeping a massive secret that no longer seemed to matter. The final entry was dated March 7, 1985. I'm 70 years old now. The bunker sits beneath my house, a monument to a war that never came. I've decided not to tell anyone about it, not even Linda. What purpose would it serve? The Cold War is winding down. The world has moved on. Perhaps this place is better left as a relic, a reminder of what we were willing to do to survive. But I've also decided to leave everything intact. Someday someone will renovate this house. They'll find the hatch. They'll discover what we built. And maybe they'll understand that we weren't crazy or paranoid. We were just people trying to protect what we loved in a world that felt like it was constantly on the brink of destruction. If you're reading this, whoever you are, know that we did our best. We lived with fear and uncertainty, but we lived. That's all any of us can do. I sat in that bunker, holding my grandfather's journal, and I felt connected to him in a way I never had when he was alive. He'd built this place not out of paranoia, but out of love. Love for his family, love for his country, love for a future he hoped would exist. My history professor friend came to visit a few weeks later, bringing colleagues from 2 universities and the Smithsonian. They spent days documenting everything, photographing the equipment, scanning the documents. The consensus was that this was one of the most complete Cold War civil defense sites ever discovered. This needs to be preserved, one of the Smithsonian curators told me, not just for historical value, but because it tells a story that most Americans don't know. Your grandfather was part of a massive, secret infrastructure designed to survive the apocalypse. People need to understand what that meant, what it felt like to live in that era. We eventually reached an agreement. I would donate certain documents and artifacts to the Smithsonian and various university collections for research and display. But the bunker itself would remain sealed, preserved under my farmhouse, a private memorial to my grandfather and the thousands of other Americans who'd quietly prepared for a war they prayed would never come. I still live in the farmhouse now. Sarah and I finished the renovations, though we left Grandpa Joe's study largely as it was. The hatch is still there, hidden under a rug now, accessible but private. Sometimes late at night, I climb down the ladder and sit in that underground office, surrounded by the ghosts of the Cold War. I think about my grandfather often. He was just an ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances, trying to balance duty and secrecy, fear and hope. He spent decades keeping that bunker ready, maintaining equipment, preserving supplies, all for a crisis that thankfully never came. In a way, that makes him a success. His life's work was preparation for disaster, and because disaster never struck, his work remained hidden. But it wasn't wasted. It represented something fundamental about the human spirit, our need to protect, to prepare, to hope that tomorrow will come. I've shown the bunker to a few trusted people. My father broke down crying when he saw it, overwhelmed by a side of his father he'd never known. My sister was fascinated, immediately wanting to know every detail. Dale still stops by occasionally, shaking his head in wonder at what we found beneath that ordinary-looking farmhouse. But mostly, I keep it to myself. It's my connection to a grandfather I barely knew, to a history most people have forgotten, to a time when the world felt like it hung by a thread, and ordinary Americans were quietly, desperately preparing for the worst. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. The nuclear arsenals still exist, but the immediate terror of annihilation has faded into background noise. My grandfather's bunker stands ready, a relic of fears that seem almost quaint now. But every time I climb down that ladder, I'm reminded that those fears were real. The people who lived through that era weren't irrational. They were responding to genuine threats in the only ways they knew how. And sometimes, late at night, sitting in that concrete room surrounded by 50-year-old equipment and faded documents, I wonder, if the world ever does fall apart, if we ever face the kind of catastrophe my grandfather prepared for, will we be ready? Will we have people like him, quietly building shelters and hoping they'll never be needed. I don't know the answer, but I'm grateful that Grandpa Joe left me more than just a farmhouse. He left me a piece of history, a window into a terrifying time, and a reminder that love sometimes means preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. The bunker beneath Prairie Hollow sits silent now, waiting for a crisis that will hopefully never come. And in that silence, I hear my grandfather's voice, echoing through the decades. We did our best. We lived. That's all any of us can do.